Mitch Steele joins me this week to discuss the changes in IPAs in the last 12 years since he published his classic book on brewing IPAs. This is Beersmith Podcast number 304. This is Beersmith Podcast number 304, and it's late May 2024. Mitch Steele joins me this week to discuss the changes in IPAs over the last 12 years since he published his book. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They recently launched an all-new experience, Craft Spirits and Distilling. If you make or love spirits, check out spiritsanddistilling.com for recipes, how-to videos, their Spirits and Distilling podcast, and much more. Again, that new site is spiritsanddistilling.com. And Beersmith Web, the online version of Beersmith brewing software. Beersmith for the web lets you design great beer recipes from any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with access to the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try Beersmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're listening on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Mitch Steele. Mitch wrote the book on IPAs called IPAs, Brewing Techniques, and the Evolution of India Pale Ale. Mitch is COO and brewmaster at New Realm Brewing Company. He's formerly the brewmaster at Stone. Mitch holds a degree in fermentation science from the University of California at Davis. And Mitch, it's a pleasure to have you on. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Brad. Thank you. It's good to be here again.
Awesome. And I assume you're down in Atlanta at New Realm. And we were talking a little bit before the show. You said things are actually going very well for you guys.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year. Our number one brand is doing very well this year. It's seeing growth that we didn't anticipate to the point that we might be short on hops this year. So I'm working through some of that. But we've been seeing some growth in Georgia, and Georgia's been a tough state for us, but we're seeing some growth and good growth this year. And we just opened a fifth location in Greenville, South Carolina, which is really exciting for us as well.
Now, where have you got locations now? I know you had one up near Virginia Beach, I think, right?
Yeah, that was our second location, Virginia Beach. That was the old Green Flash Brewery that we took over in 2018. And then we took over a brew pub just outside of Charleston, South Carolina, a few years ago, and have been running that for a while. Last year, we opened up a small 7-barrel brewing system and a tap room on the campus of Auburn University. So that has been fun. They've got a master's program in brewing science that we've been supporting as well, with doing some classes and things like that. And then Greenville just this past month. And so we have 5 locations now. It's been exciting. And Greenville is an amazing facility. We're really excited about that one.
Well, I'm happy to see that you're growing, because I was talking to some of the folks that came back from the craft beer conference, and they told me, things are down overall, I believe, in the industry, right?
Yeah, it's flat or down for most people, and there are a number of breweries that are showing some growth, but most of the bigger breweries are not. It's a tough time. I mean, it's been really tough. People that drink alcoholic beverages have changing preferences. They're drinking different things. Spirits are really growing. Marijuana's having an impact on the business as well. And seriously, I saw a chart just the other day that showed that daily use of marijuana has outpaced daily use of alcohol for the first time since they've started looking at this. And it's a real thing, because if people are smoking marijuana, they're not drinking as much beer as they used to.
Yeah, I had Keith Villa on last week, and he runs Saria, but of course he launched Blue Moon back when he's working for the big brewers. Originally launched Saria, which is a non-alcoholic beer, or zero alcohol beer actually, with the intention of infusing cannabis into it. But when they started doing it, they were still pretty hindered because of the laws. The fact that it's still like a Schedule III at the federal level. But he was telling me, it's he's in Colorado, and things are very, very big market there, as you might imagine.
Yeah, and it's getting legalized in more places all the time. So it's a very real thing. I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it a threat, but it's something that I think the beer industry needs to deal with a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And then he was also mentioning the other thing that's growing. I think is they're like almost like the old wine cooler type thing, but they're usually made with vodka or something like that instead. Sort of the fruity mixed drinks thing,
Yeah,
prepackaged.
yeah, the ready to drink vodka based fruit seltzer things. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean they're
exactly.
everywhere. They're
Yeah,
everywhere.
interesting. It's even pushing a lot of the seltzers out. But
Yeah, it is.
um, so, anyways, this week I wanted to talk about IPAs, and of course, you wrote the book, and I got a copy here. It's the IPA book from the Brewers Association. You wrote the book way back in 2012. And I mean, did you know back then that IPAs were going to take off like they did in the craft beer world?
Yeah, I think I had an inkling, that I mean, certainly the brewery I was working at, Stone Brewing, was heavily focused on IPAs. And it was, kind of our gig, and we saw it taking off everywhere. But to the extent that it did, I'm not sure about that. I remember. Gosh, and I may have mentioned this before, but
Yeah.
somebody once mentioned that IPA was the new Bud Light, and that excited me and terrified me at the same time. It was one of those things where I'm not sure this is a good thing. If everything becomes IPA, then what is going to be craft beer? But certainly, it has allowed a lot of us brewers to be very successful, especially those of us that focus on IPAs. But yeah, I think the extent at which it has become, the thing in craft beer has been really interesting, and a little bit beyond what I would have thought had happened.
Yeah. I think, a couple of years ago, it was threatening to blot out almost all the other craft beers, it seemed like. I mean, I would go to the grocery store and basically you couldn't get much craft beer except for an IPA. But I think that trend's starting to turn too, just a little bit, anyways. Um,
Yeah, I think so too. I think it encourages me that we're starting to see some lager growth in craft and pilsners and lighter styles and just styles that aren't IPA. And I love IPA and I always will, but um, having a homogenous offering of craft beer out there, I don't think is healthy for the business. I think variety is what fueled the growth of the business, and variety will continue to be very important. So, if IPA slows down a little bit and some other beer styles are able to make their way into consumer mindset, I think that's a good thing.
yeah, you spent almost the first half of the book talking about the history of IPA, covering English beer from the 1700s through the rise of English IPA in the 1700s. Um, So going back to some of those early IPAs, how did those differ from, say, a modern English IPA, for example?
It's interesting. I think one of the things that I learned in doing the research for the book is that the IPA back then, ingredient wise, was very similar. I mean, it was a very pale malt. It was very bitter. It had a tremendous amount of hops in it. And so from that standpoint, it was very similar. But once the beer was brewed, then things changed quite a bit. And I think the first thing that I would mention that was different in the 1800s versus now is the freshness factor. The beer that was brewed in the 1800s was aged for a year plus before it was even put on a boat to India. So by the time people in India or elsewhere in the world, wherever it was being shipped to, got it and were able to drink it, it was at least a year old, sometimes closer to 2 years old. So the freshness factor that we're also concerned about today was not part of the equation back then. And then I think the other thing is the yeast cultures that were being used in Britain back in the 1800s had Brettanomyces in them. So part of this aging and this mystical flavor change that happened as the beer aged and as it shipped was very likely due to Brettanomyces fermentation, and some of the impact of that on the flavor and the character of the beer. And certainly, the beers back then were described as being champagne like, and French champagne and French wine is known, to have had and maybe still has a fair amount of Brettanomyces yeast in it. Back 30, 40 years ago when I was making wine, we would taste French wines and we would get Brettanomyces in a lot of them. So
Hmm.
it's certainly not uncommon. And I think, if I put those, kind of connect the dots there and talk about, how the flavor was described, I think that Brettanomyces character was definitely present in the 1800s IPA. So today we're talking about fresh beer, clean beer, one yeast strain, and not having secondary and tertiary fermentations.
And I mean, they were all stored in barrels too. So if you store a beer in a barrel for over a year, obviously you're getting some oxygen introduced. So there's some aging going on there as well, I would imagine.
Absolutely, and so the beer, wasn't it probably not as aggressively bitter in flavor, even though it was hopped to bitterness levels like we would do today. Over time in a barrel with a subtle changes of oxidation, I'm sure that bitterness softened quite a bit.
And then they were just introducing coke-fired malting as well. So I imagine a lot of the malts were actually smoked, right?
Yeah, in the very early days. Now the pale malt and the coke fired kilning of malt really got a stronghold in the 1800s, and that's really the heyday of the IPA. And it's interesting, the some of the legendary British brewmasters that I talked to in doing research for the book indicated that the malting and kilning process for IPA malt was different than a lot of beers in England at the time in the 1800s, and it was designed to be a very low temperature kilning, develop very little flavor. And so,
Hmm.
the beer was supposed to be as pale as they could possibly get it. And even carrying that on into the kettle boil, where they undersized the kettles so they couldn't do this huge vigorous boil that we're looking for now. It was more of a simmer, just so they didn't develop too much color.
Interesting. Now you spent a lot of time talking about the Burton IPA, which is not necessarily a well-known style to a lot of modern brewers, but can you talk about how the Burton IPA was a little bit different and how that impacted the India beer market?
Yeah, I think, the big thing about the beers that were being brewed in Burton is the water chemistry and the presence of extremely high levels of sulfate in the water, and what that did, and also the calcium levels as well. And so what that did is that mineral content in that water not only accentuated the bitterness of the
Hmm.
hops a bit, but also promoted yeast settling. And so the beer would be crystal clear, in when it was served, and that was a very hard thing for British brewers to do at the time. But if you brewed in Burton and you had that water profile, it really helped the yeast settle out, and you ended up with a brilliantly clear beer. And this was, obviously a time before, filtration, centrifugation, or any sort of real fining agents were used in the brewing industry. So I think that was a big part of it. Back then in Burton, they had first pick of the hops. They were big brewers. They got those fresh East Kent Goldings hops, and when they were brewing IPAs, they used the freshest ingredients possible. So they were really only brewing right after the harvest up until about springtime, and then they brewed other things. And so the IPA always had the best and the freshest ingredients possible. So I think that was different as well.
Yeah. Well, IPA was a style that actually almost died out. Was it the craft beer revolution that kind of revived it? And I think it died almost twice, right? Isn't that right?
Yeah, so it was a victim of prohibition. It was a victim of taxation in England. The World Wars really drove down any sort of brewing of higher alcohol styles, and I think England is still trying to get back to that. There's still a bit of a backlash against anything that's over 6% alcohol. And if you're brewing in England, you're taxed on, original gravity of the beer, not just how much volume you produce. So there's a scale of taxation that's based on how strong your beer is. So it's a pretty powerful incentive to not brew anything really strong. Um, so the taxation in England and prohibition in the United States just about killed it. And the one brand that stood the test of time and withstood prohibition was Ballantine IPA. But then all the consolidation that happened in the 60s and 70s in the big brewing business killed Ballantine, and it was pretty much gone by the 1970s. Ballantine IPA,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, it tried to survive. But I do think that craft brewing is really what brought the IPA back, and certainly, Fritz Maytag at Anchor and Ken Grossman at Sierra Nevada, brewing Liberty Ale and brewing Celebration Ale in the mid 70s and the late 80s, or the early 1980s, respectively. Both those gentlemen were inspired by Ballantine IPA and the fact that they couldn't get it anymore. And I learned that with interviews with both breweries when I was researching the book, that both of them wanted to brew something like they remembered Ballantine IPA to be. So they get the credit for kickstarting it, but really craft brewing, as we tended to do back then, latched onto it as a style that wasn't available, and said, well, we can brew this, and let's do it. And I think that's really how craft beer got a start. We were all trying to do something that the big brewers weren't doing, and create some beer styles, or just beers that you couldn't find in the supermarket, and you couldn't find from a big brewer. And craft brewers love hops, and so it just took off from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me, at least at the commercial level, it seemed to me like we went in sort of a pale ale phase, and then that kind of morphed into an IPA phase, really, at least in the early days of craft brewing.
Yeah, and I think that's just a natural evolution as people developed a taste for hops and developed a taste for bitterness. I think that was a natural progression of beer brewing and beer styles. And then of course it took off and became the IBU arms race, and everybody wanted to make a beer more bitter than the next guy.
Yeah.
And and it became a source of pride and kind of a badge of honor, to be able to drink a beer that had 120 or IBUs or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I'm drinking this because this is more hoppy than anything you'll ever have. And certainly there was an element of that in the early to mid 2000s that was kind of fun.
Yeah. It's kind of coming around full circle. Now people are moving, I think, more towards more balanced beers, though, to a large degree,
Yeah, I think so.
more drinkable.
Yeah, and I think beer in itself, I think, is an acquired taste. There's very few people that taste beer for the first time and say, "Oh, that's my beverage," right? You've got to get used to the flavor, and bitterness adds another level of um, of taste that you have to condition yourself to,
Yeah.
and acquire. And so beer's one thing, but then a bitter beer takes it to another level as far as acquiring a taste for it.
I agree. Yeah. The second half of the book focuses on IPA style variations, and then you have recipes and brewing techniques associated with those. One of the things that always struck me is how simple many of the modern recipes are. Often you just got pale malt and a single hop variety that you're, hopping at different stages, but still. Why do some people try and, take it and overcomplicate their IPAs, I guess?
Uh, that's a real good question. I can give you a practical answer, but I think um, i- and the practical answer is, if you have a change in the hop from crop year to crop year, or you have an availability issue, if you're using several hop varieties in your dry hop, you can weather that storm and do some crafty blending to try and get the same taste profile. And I
Sure.
think that's, from a practical standpoint, that's smart. And I think it's effective. I think, there can only be so many Centennial IPAs out there, right?
Yeah.
And so, you have, three of the biggest IPA brewers in Bell's and Founders and Stone. We're brewing their flagship IPAs that really focused on Centennial hops. So,
Yep.
brewers don't want to do exactly what everybody else is doing. So they looked at other hop varieties, and the blending part, I think, was just, trying to make it so that one hop profile didn't stand out and become so easily identifiable. And, in these days with some of the hops that are out there, some of the newer varieties, I think that's important because, and this is just me personally, but if I have a beer that's 100% mosaic, I don't find that all that exciting. I'd rather taste something that's a blend of hops, and Centennial. I'm the other way. I love to have a beer that's 100% Centennial or 100% Simcoe, but that's just my personal taste. But I think the blending can be fun and can really help bring out different layers of flavor from the hop, and I think that's really what drives most brewers to blend hops in their IPA recipes. There are. I'm hearing this a lot now. When I talk to brewers that have a lot of experience brewing hoppy beers, and they talk about a hop that plays well with others. And there's certain hops that come to mind. Strata is one of those hops. I think Azaka is one of those hops.
Hmm.
A hop that may not be all that outstanding as a single hop IPA, but you blend it with some other hop varieties and then it really shines and it accentuates the other flavors that you're getting from the other hops. And so I've latched onto that myself. And we do a lot of work with that. And I think it's an artistic expression. So it excites a lot of brewers to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some parallels on the grain side as well. I'm a big fan of porters and stouts, and I really don't like a one-dimensional porter that's made with just one type of dark grain or one type of base malt. As you blend the malts, it starts to add depth to the overall beer.
Yeah, exactly. And there's you can go overboard with it, but I think a porter that uses five different malts is infinitely more interesting than a porter that uses two malts.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a lot of value in that. And I have a lot of conversations with brewing friends because I've got friends that have been professional brewers that like to use 10 different malts in their beers. And then I've worked with people and have friends that like to use two or three. And I remember um, talking with Steve Wagner at Stone, who was my first boss at Stone, and who I really respected as far as the way he put together beers. And we were talking about Old Guardian barley wine, and his barley wine had two malts in it, and I'm like, Steve, wouldn't you want to add some more malts to this? Tell me what you're thinking about here with this recipe. And they'd been brewing it for years, and it was a wonderful beer. And his comment was, "This is a beer where I really want the yeast character to shine. This is what I want to focus on, the yeast and the flavors that develop during the fermentation of this high alcohol beer, and I don't want the malt to get in the way." Which I thought was a very interesting way to look at a barley wine.
Hmm.
And I loved Old Guardian, and I didn't change it. And Steve was awesome. He said, "If you want to change it, go for it." I said, "No, I like it. I just was curious about, your thought process as you put it together."
That's cool. Awesome. Well, since you published the book in 2012, we've seen an explosion of new IPA styles, from the successful to the much less successful. Uh, what are some of your favorite variations that did succeed?
Well, I have to say something about Hazy IPA because it's our number one brand, and
Yeah.
our brand is Hazy like a fox, and it's done really well for us. But in all honesty, I was a little skeptical because I had lived through black IPA and white IPA and this and that, and I just saw these things come and go for whatever reason. And so when people started getting really excited about New England IPA, I was like, is this just another fad, or is this something that's going to have some legs? I certainly would not have predicted it to become the number one IPA substyle in the country,
Yeah.
but it certainly is. And as I learned about how these beers were being brewed and how out of left field some of the ingredient usage and brewing processes where I gained a very healthy respect for it as a style, and just the innovation that went into it I thought was amazing. So I give credit where credit's due, and those brewers that the Hill Farmsteads and the um, what's the other one?
Oh,
The Alchemist, and
yeah,
then
that's what I
later
was thinking of.
Treehouse and Trillium and some of those folks did some amazing things with brewing beer, and they took some chances that most IPA brewers never would have thought of doing, and I think that's pretty cool. Um, so that's one that was obviously wildly successful.
And
I
again, trend towards drinkability too. A very drinkable beer when you come down to it. You know.
Yeah, it's a softer IPA. It's got lower bitterness. It's got more mouthfeel. It appeals to a lot of beer drinkers where, that aren't maybe not ready for a West Coast, or a West Coast IPA is too aggressive for them. And plus, you get the juicy flavors, from that biotransformation. So you're
Yeah,
getting flavors that people are familiar with already. Um, it works. It's been a huge success, and it's for a lot of brewers. It's saved their breweries, and that's wonderful.
awesome. Are there any other successful ones you want to mention? I mean, there's quite a few that have been added since you published the book.
Yeah, I think I think the one that may be successful, is kind of too early to tell, but the cold IPA, I think is a neat riff on the style. With the whole Pilsner fermentation or lager fermentation,
Hmm.
and the Pilsner malt, and getting this really crisp and lower IBU version of an IPA. For me, it checks a lot of boxes for me, just because
Interesting.
I'm not drinking beer with as high alcohol content anymore, and I like the crispness and the drinkability of it. I think one of the ones that I wish had stuck around a little bit more is the Brute IPA, and I understand why it didn't. Um, Brute IPA. Our wholesaler told us that when people looked at a beer called Brute IPA, their first reaction was not extra dry champagne, which was what the reference was. Uh, it was aftershave, or brute aftershave, and people looked at that and they said, "Brute IPA, is that going to taste like brute cologne?" And it's
Poorly
like,
named, huh?
oh boy, that's not going to work, right? And I think that honestly, I think that's part of what killed it. But the whole idea of having a low carb, extremely dry IPA where the hops really shine, I thought it worked stylistically. I just think it was an unfortunate name and unfortunate branding. But some people have had success with brewed IPAs doing lower calorie, low carb session IPAs with the amylase enzyme, and making an IPA with a lower alcohol content, and that has worked for some people. So I'd say it is veered off into a niche that has some success, but not as it was originally named, not as a brewed IPA.
As I mentioned, I had Keith Villa on, and he mentioned that when he launched Blue Moon in the '90s, he was competing against Zima. So what are some of the IPA variants that are the Zima of the less
Oh,
successful variants that we've launched the last 12 years?
oh my gosh. Let's see. Less successful. Well, black IPA didn't quite take hold. I think the name, people really took offense at the name, which is unfortunate, because I think, in my opinion, it got very confused when a certain subset of brewers started calling it Cascadian Dark. I think that confused people, because nobody knew what that meant. My argument always was, well, if you have a beer and you're calling it a black IPA and you see it in a bar, you know exactly what you should be getting. You should be getting a black beer that tastes like an IPA. Now, it's not a pale ale, but IPA is not IPA anymore anyway. So to me, I never had a problem with that. Now people are calling it American Black Ale, which is fine, but it's not as clear a defining description as black IPA is. But yeah, people really got upset with the fact that it was contradictory and all that, and I think that did not help it. And the other thing is, and I'm not going to blame its failure on all that, but I think the other thing is that people, just craft beer drinkers in general, just don't really drink dark beers. I mean, dark beers are a tough sell for any brewery. There's a few out there that have been wildly successful, and some as seasonals. But as a flagship brand or as a brand you produce year round, I think darker beers have a tougher time of it, and I think that hurt it. Um, I think the white IPA, the cross between the Belgian wit and an IPA, just never really worked.
Hmm.
I don't think it worked as a style. I think it just was kind of a mess, honestly. And we tried to make them. I like the idea, I like the concept, but I think with the coriander and everything, you just got something that it was very hard to make it very refined and where all the flavors really played well together. Um, Gosh, what am I missing?
Well, Brute IPA wasn't all that successful, even though you enjoy it.
Yeah, no, and I jumped on it and tried to brew it, and I thought it was kind of a neat idea, but it just didn't resonate with people, and that's okay. We can try different things, and it's all good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, IPAs are closely aligned with an explosion in hop science the last 12 years as well. What are some of the things about hops we didn't know back when you wrote your book?
Oh, I think the contribution of thiols from the hops to
Yeah.
the overall aromatic qualities of the beer. I think that's all really new stuff, and it's interesting because I think as we're learning this, we're kind of moving away from looking at the oils, most of which are lost in the brewing process and get scrubbed out during fermentation, and we're starting to put a lot more focus on thiols and their contribution to the overall hop character in a beer. And I think that's been fascinating, and all the work that's being done in universities like at OSU and places like that are really trying to understand the chemistry behind the hops and really what's contributing to the flavors, be it caddy, be it passion fruit, be it grapefruit, whatever. Is it all due to oils, or is it due to thiols that are present in much much smaller concentrations? And I think we're learning a lot about that.
I mean, even our understanding of aroma oils was not anywhere near what it is today, 12 years
No,
ago.
no, and I think the popularity of hoppy beers has prompted a tremendous amount of research into this, and I think it's fascinating to read all this stuff. And then biotransformation, of course, is with the action of the yeast enzymes on certain hop oils to transform them into other compounds. I think is absolutely fascinating from a science standpoint. And I think it's just it's amazing. And then I say the final thing on hop research that's going on right now is just all the breeding programs
Yeah.
and developing these new varieties that contribute new and different types of flavors to beer. I think that's really driving a lot of the growth of IPA still.
Yeah, and I actually want to mention dry hopping too. I mean, dry hopping techniques have changed quite a bit over the years, haven't they?
Yeah, they sure have. It's from just the process of adding the hops to the beer and how to do it. It's a very difficult process to carry hops up to the top of a tank and dump them in and be safe and not have a volcano of beer exploding out into your face. And so people started looking at this, and brewers started creating different ways of doing it. And we started off with things like hop cannons and circulation vessels, and now we have these emulsifying contraptions that grind up the hops and shoot them into a flowing circulation stream of beer. And then as we've moved on, some of the liquid hop products that are out there now, I'm really excited about, and really doing a deep dive into those. That you can just pour in the top, and of the tank, and you don't have to worry about the solid material from the leaf material of the hops. You get the flavor of the hop without adding dry hops and losing a lot of volume in your fermenter due to the absorption of the beer. And they're getting better and better and better. And I think when I first started looking at these 6 years ago, they were really neat and really exciting, but they did not replicate the flavor of a Type 90 hop pellet.
Hmm.
And so what I was doing back then was I was using them in conjunction and kind of augmenting the hop pellet dry hop with a hop oil, and that worked. It was really pretty cool to see. But now there's so many products out there that I haven't tried yet that I'm dying to try and really see if it's something that could improve efficiencies and the bottom line for breweries and still get a flavor that people are familiar with. And that's really the key with any of these products is to make sure that the flavor isn't too far of a departure from what people are expecting when they taste a dry hop beer. And then just timing of dry hops is going all over the place. There's mid fermentation dry hops. There's people adding dry hops before the end of fermentation. There's all the work that's going into hop creep and what happens, when you add hops in the presence of live yeast, and you get a restart of the fermentation and some diacetyl production that you got to deal with, and all the science that's going on behind all of that is amazing to me. So it's certainly an exciting time for hops and what's going on in the business. And if you pay attention to it, you can really do some new and innovative things with hops in your brewery, and I think that's always exciting for a brewer.
Yeah, I think the hop oils in particular are almost like a new frontier because I mean they can isolate individual compounds now. You can think about blending those compounds into different flavors. It's really kind of an exciting time.
It really is, and they're pulling, these companies are pulling terpenes and hop oil, oils from hops and things like that out of hemp, out of fruit, out of all these kind of botanical products, and they're getting these flavors that mimic hops and or exactly certain components from hops. And you can, just depends on how deep of a dive you want to take into this, but I think you could do some really neat things. And really where I think these products have hit a home run is with non-alcoholic beer production. And doing, if you're doing a process where you're removing the alcohol and you've dry hopped the beer, you're going to lose all that dry hop character. So you can, if you remove the alcohol from the beer, you've got a product sitting in a bright tank. You can add a hop oil and have very minimal risk as far as oxidation or contamination or wild yeast or anything like that. Whereas if you have a non-alcoholic beer and it's in a bright tank and you add hop pellets, you're introducing a whole bunch of risk for fermentation and things like that. So I think the hop oils in NA IPAs is a real benefit to people who are trying to make good ones.
Yeah, I mean we didn't discuss it, but the NA market and the zero alcohol market is growing fairly rapidly, right?
Yeah, it is, and a lot of brewers are focusing on IPAs, and it's really hard to get that Type 90 hop pellet character to carry through the end
Yeah.
to the end product.
Well, Mitch, if you were writing a new version of your book today, what are some of the big changes you would highlight in IPA brewing? I know we just
uh,
discussed a lot of them, but
we did, and I would definitely hit on the thiol work and the research work that's going on into hop chemistry a lot more than I did. I really didn't hit on that too hard in the first book. I would talk about the emergence of hazy IPA and the growth of hazy IPA and how it's come to dominate the IPA category in the United States, and we're seeing it in Europe now too. I saw somebody quoted uh, a couple of weeks ago that said, referring to English beer, that hazy IPA was the new bitter. And I'm like, okay,
interesting.
that's pretty interesting. Um, and I think, another thing I think I'd hit on that we haven't talked about is these thiolizing yeasts that are out there
Yeah.
that are freeing up the thiols that are bound in hops to other compounds. They're bound in hops and they're bound in malt, and they usually, through normal brewing processes, don't have a chance to express themselves as flavor. And then you get a thiolizing yeast in there that breaks that apart and frees up thiols that produce a tremendous amount of tropical fruit. It's and flavors in the beer. It's amazing. And we do a beer at New Realm. It's called Psychedelic Rabbit, and it is fermented with Star Party yeast. And day two of fermentation, that whole beer changes from what was originally a pretty close to a standard West Coast IPA recipe to a passion fruit bomb. And that is day 2 of fermentation, just because of the yeast that we use in the fermentation, and we don't have to do a mid fermentation hop to get the tropical and the juiciness. We can do a post fermentation hop and get our citrus and lemon and piney and that kind of thing. But it's been a lot of fun to play with that, and I think that would have to be part of the book as well.
Awesome. Do you have any predictions on what might be the next new great IPA?
No.
I was hoping you would know so I could get on it.
Oh man, I wish. I think so. So there's a couple of things that are happening now that we're paying attention to, and we're brewing and we're having some fun with. Number one, I think a lot of brewers that are brewing West Coast IPAs have evolved their malt recipes to be 2-row malt, a combination of 2-row malt and Pilsner malt. And so really accentuating the brightness of the beer and the crispness of the beer, and allowing the hop character to shine and giving it a lighter body. And I'm seeing that with a lot of West Coast brewers. And we did that with a recent West Coast IPA that we released. And we wouldn't have done it except that we knew a lot of West Coast IPA brewers had moved in that direction. So I think that's fairly interesting. And we'll see if that takes hold. Just 30-40% Pilsner malt and the balance American 2-row, and then you've got your IPA, and then you hop it like an IPA. And then the other piece of that goes along with it somewhat is a reduction in bitterness levels in IPAs that are being sold as West Coast IPAs. Instead of 70, 80 IBUs, more like 55 to 70, 55, 65 IBUs is we're seeing a lot more of that.
Yeah. I think I mentioned, move back towards one more balanced IPA, really,
Yeah.
something more drinkable.
And it reflects changing tastes and generational changes and all that kind of stuff that goes into, who's, the studies about who's drinking your beer and, what are the young drinkers, the 21 to 26-year-olds drinking, because they're going to drink more on a volume basis than anybody else. And us older folks are drinking less and less beer every day by necessity, and so, even if we want that 75 IBU West IPA, we're not going to drink 6-packs of it like we did in the past. So, there's that natural evolution. The other thing I think is kind of interesting that we're having some fun with is this whole West Coast Pilsner thing, which to me is very similar to a cold IPA, but it's a Pilsner beer that is dry hopped like an IPA. So it's not at the same alcohol level as a cold IPA. It's not at the same bitterness level as a cold IPA. It's, when we've brewed a Pilsner base that's about 30 IBUs, using German malts and the whole bit. And we ferment it with, German lager yeast. And then after the primary fermentation, we dry hop it like an IPA. And people are very confused by it as a style. But again, this was something that, some people I know pretty well out in Southern California have been doing for a while. And, we jumped on it as soon as we heard about it and tried it, and we've had some fun with it. And it makes for a nice beer. It's 5%, so it's not too much of an alcohol punch, but it's got that dry hop flavor and aroma that IPA drinkers will like. And maybe that's the next big thing. I don't know. I think if you look at the beer industry analysts, they all talk about things moving towards lighter, lower alcohol, lighter color, less bitter, and I think we're seeing that in the evolution of IPA. I don't think it's going to get to the point where it's a 3% beer like it did in the UK in the 1900s. I hope not, because that's a travesty. But as long as it stays interesting and full flavored, I'm all aboard for wherever way it goes.
Awesome. Just a quick question, but how do you think somebody from, say, the 1700s sitting in India would react if they tasted a modern American IPA or even a hazy IPA?
I think they'd hate it, honestly. And I think the reverse is true. I think if somebody sat down and tasted an English early 1800s IPA, they'd be shocked by it. They may not hate it because I think, and I was listening to, I went to a talk by Ron Pattinson, who's a
Yeah.
beer historian, and he was talking about it, and he said the closest thing to that 1800s IPA right now is Orval. And and that makes a lot of sense, because that's a fairly hoppy beer that has a finishing addition of Brettanomyces, and he's probably not far off the mark with what those beers may have tasted like. So, but yeah, I think a colonist in India getting a beer that's slammed with Simcoe hops, that'd be fun to watch, I think.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Mitch, I just want to give you another chance to plug New Realm, talk about your locations or your distribution. Where are you distributing now?
Yeah, so our rule is we only distribute in states and areas where we have a brewery and a restaurant on the ground. So we want to be part of the local communities we're in, and be part of the local scene, and contribute to the communities. And so we're not trying to sell our beer in any state that we don't have a facility and we don't have a presence with people working for us. And to that end, so we sell our beer throughout the state of Virginia. We sell our beer throughout the state of Georgia, where we have two of our breweries. We have a brewery in Georgia and a brewery in Virginia. Those were our first two. We have two breweries in South Carolina now. We had been selling our beer only in the coastal area of South Carolina, because we had a brewery in Charleston, and now that we're open in Greenville, we're getting into the northern areas of South Carolina, and we're just barely dipping our toes into Alabama, right around the Auburn campus and the Auburn area. We're not really distributed much further than that area in Alabama, but we'll see as things progress if we can get a stronger foothold there. I'm not sure. We'll try even, but so we're in 4 different states, and we try to focus our distribution beer sales in areas where we actually have a working brewery and a tap room. So,
Nice.
We want people to come into our tap rooms and taste our beer, and then look for it, when they go shopping. And we want people that are shopping to see our beer and then think about our tap rooms and thinking about coming and visiting us. So that's kind of how we've approached it. And I think given the times, that's worked. I working for a very large national brewery, I saw how hard it was getting towards the end of my time at Stone, how hard it was getting to get focus in areas where we didn't have a brewery. And there's so many great local beers coming, starting up in all the cities we were in. And it was, and probably rightfully so, it was harder to compete. When you have a whole bunch of local brewers, people want to support the local brewers and help support them, as opposed to some brewery they've never been to that's thousands of miles away. So we certainly embrace that philosophy, and we try to live it. But yeah, we have 5 locations now. Every one of them is different. Very different from each other. So, I think, if people think we're a chain, we're not a chain. We do have multiple locations, but if you go into every one, you're going to get a vastly different experience than the other one. And that's important to us as well.
Well, Mitch, appreciate you coming on the show and updating us on IPAs. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, bro. Always fun to talk.
Today, my guest was Mitch Steele, the author of the book IPAs and brewmaster at New Realm Brewing Company. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
Well, a big thank you to Mitch Steele for joining me today. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They recently launched an all-new experience called Craft Spirits and Distilling. If you make or love spirits, check out spiritsanddistilling.com for recipes, how-to videos, their Spirits and Distilling podcast, and much more. Again, that news site is spiritsanddistilling.com. And Beersmith Web, the online version of Beersmith Brewing software. Beersmith for the web lets you design great beer recipes for any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with access to the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try Beersmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.